Walter Briggs didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to the Silver Creek Ranch office swung open hard enough to crack against the wall, and he walked in like a man who had already decided how everything would end. He dropped a stack of papers onto Nathan Caldwell's desk, loan documents, foreclosure notices, numbers that didn't add up, but were signed in the right places by the right people. And he said, without sitting down, without even taking off his hat, "You've got 30 days. After that, everything on this land belongs to the bank." Nathan looked at the papers. He looked at the man, and Walter Briggs smiled the way men smile when they already know they've won. If you've ever watched someone take everything from a person who had nothing left to lose, stick with this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit like and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Mara Whitlock arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, she had $11.40 in her coat pocket, 3 children who hadn't eaten a hot meal in 2 days, and a name that meant nothing in Garrison, Montana. She had tried the feed store first. The man behind the counter looked at her, the way people look at something they've already decided isn't their problem, the quick assessment, the slight backward lean, careful neutrality of someone who wanted her to leave without him having to say so. She'd asked about work. He'd said he wasn't hiring. She'd asked if he knew anyone who was. He'd said he didn't know. She'd said thank you and walked out because there was nothing else to say, and because her children were watching from the wagon, and she wasn't going to let them see her beg. The baker had been kinder, in the way people are kind when they want to feel generous without actually giving anything. He'd let her fill her water jar and told her about the Caldwell place, Silver Creek Ranch, 8 miles north, a cattle operation that had been struggling for the better part of 2 years. He'd said the cook had quit 3 weeks back, and nobody had replaced her yet. He'd said it with the particular tone men use when they're describing a situation they consider beneath them, as if the information was charity enough. Mara had thanked him and climbed back onto the wagon. Her oldest, Clara, was 12 and already old enough to read silences. She looked at her mother's face and didn't ask questions. The 2 younger ones, Owen, who was 8, and little Bess, who had just turned 6, were asleep against each other in the wagon bed, sharing one thin blanket that had seen better years. The October air was coming in cold off the mountains. Mara pulled the reins and turned the horse north. She didn't think about whether she belonged there. Stopped thinking about belonging 6 months ago, when her husband Thomas had died of a fever that a doctor in a bigger town might have caught earlier, and the creditors had arrived within the week. And the house she'd spent 9 years making into something livable was sold to cover debts she hadn't known existed. She didn't think about it, because thinking about it didn't help. Kept moving or you didn't. That was all there was. The Silver Creek Ranch gate was wood and iron, with the ranch's name burned into the crossbeam. One of the gate posts was leaning. The fence line running from it needed mending in at least 4 places she could see from the road. Mara noted these things the way she noted everything quietly, without judgment, just information. She stopped the wagon at the gate and sat for a moment. The ranch yard was not what she expected. It was not abandoned. There were men moving between the buildings, horses in the corral, smoke coming from a chimney on the far side, but it had the look of a place that had stopped caring about itself. The barn door was hanging at an angle. The tools left out in the dirt. Pile of split wood that had been rained on and left to sit. Kind of disorder that builds up slowly when everyone is too tired to fix anything that isn't on fire. Climbed down from the wagon and tied the horse to the gate post. "Stay here," she told the children. Clara nodded. Owen started to protest. Mara looked at him once. He stopped. She walked across the yard to the main building, a long, low structure with a porch that needed new boards, and knocked on the door. The man who answered was not Nathan Caldwell. He was stocky, somewhere in his 40s, with a foreman's bearing and a foreman's suspicion. His name, she would learn later, was Pete Hollis, and he had been running the day-to-day operations of Silver Creek for 11 years. He looked at her the way the feed store man had looked at her, but with less pretense about it. "Help you," he said. "I'm looking for work," Mara said. "I heard your cook left." Pete's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it, not softening exactly, more like recalibration. "That was 3 weeks ago," he said. "We've been making do." "Making do how?" He looked at her for a moment. "Boiling salt pork. Mostly. For 3 weeks? Men don't complain." "Men don't complain," Mara said, "because they've stopped expecting anything better." She paused. "Where's the stove?" "I'll start tonight." Pete stared at her. It was the kind of stare that was deciding something, though Mara couldn't tell what. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Mr. Caldwell will want to talk to you first." She followed him inside. The main room was functional and nothing else: a long table, mismatched chairs, a wood stove that wasn't being used for anything at the moment, ledger books stacked on a sideboard. Through a doorway, she could see the kitchen, and even from that distance, she could tell it was a problem. The smell coming out of it was not quite rot, but it was close. Something had soured in there and not been dealt with. Nathan Caldwell came in from a back room, still pulling on his coat. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, probably, though he carried himself like someone who had been tired for a long time. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that came from years outside and not enough sleep. He looked at her with an expression that was carefully controlled, which meant he was either naturally reserved or had learned to be. "Pete said you're looking for work." He said, "I am." "What's your experience?" 15 years cooking for a working ranch. Before that, I cooked for a logging camp in Oregon for 2 seasons. I can stretch $1 further than most men can stretch 3, and I don't waste what I've got. Nathan looked at her. Then he looked past her through the window, and she realized he was looking at the wagon, at the children. "Those yours?" he said. "Yes." "How many?" 3. A silence settled in the room. It was the kind of silence that meant he was calculating something, not just the cost of feeding extra mouths, but some more complicated arithmetic she couldn't quite see. "The bunkhouse is full," he said. "I don't have separate quarters." "The wagon's fine for now," Mara said. "If the arrangement works out, we can sort out something more permanent." Another silence. Pete was watching both of them. "I'll pay you $12 a month," Nathan said finally. 3 meals a day, 6 days a week, Sundays your own. It was less than she'd hoped for. It was more than she'd feared. "That's fine," she said. Nathan nodded, not warmly but not coldly either, and gestured toward the kitchen. "Go ahead and take a look. Whatever you need for supplies, make me a list." She went through the doorway. The kitchen was worse than the smell had suggested. Previous cook had left in a hurry or in anger, possibly both. There were pots left unwashed, a film of grease on every surface, a bin of flour that had gone to weevils, a meat hook with something on it that had been there too long. The garden window was broken, and the cold was coming through. One of the legs on the work table had been wedged with a folded piece of paper that was now soggy and ineffective, so the whole table tilted when you touched it. Mara stood in the middle of it and looked around slowly. She wasn't discouraged. She'd seen worse. What she saw wasn't a disaster, it was just neglect, and neglect was fixable. She opened every cabinet. She checked every shelf. She found a 50-pound sack of cornmeal that had been pushed to the back and forgotten, dried beans in 3 different jars, a cured ham hock, onions that were mostly still good, salt lard, 2 cast-iron skillets that were buried under other things and hadn't been ruined, and a root cellar she discovered through a hatch in the floor that had turnips and potatoes and what turned out to be a crock of sauerkraut someone had put up last fall. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She went back out to the wagon and got her children. Clara took one look at the kitchen and began rolling up her sleeves without being asked. Owen stood in the doorway making a face at the smell. Bess was carrying the small cloth bag that held the family's cooking tools, Mara's own knife, her own wooden spoon, a tin measuring cup, because Mara had learned a long time ago that the things you couldn't replace were the things you carried yourself. "Owen," Mara said, "there's a root cellar through that hatch. I need you to hand up everything you find in there." "It smells," Owen said. "Yes, it does," Mara said. "Hand up everything anyway." By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the kitchen no longer smelled like the inside of a mistake. The surfaces had been scrubbed. The broken cabinet door had been propped back into position. The window was covered with a piece of burlap from the barn, not pretty, not permanent, but it kept the cold out. The work table was steady again, because Mara had found a proper wood wedge and used it. By 5 o'clock there was cornbread in the oven, and a pot of beans and ham hock on the stove, and the smell coming out of the Silver Creek Ranch kitchen was something that made the men in the bunkhouse sit up and look at each other without saying anything. Pete Hollis came through the kitchen door at 5:45, ostensibly to check on wood supply. He stayed for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the pot on the stove. "You found all this in here," he said. "Most of it," Mara said. "The ham hock was yours. The rest I supplemented from what we had." "From what you had," Pete repeated. "We don't travel empty," she said. He left without another word. But she noticed when she brought the food out to the long table that he was the first one seated. There were 22 men at Silver Creek Ranch. Ranch hands, a fence crew, 2 brothers who handled the horses, a young man named Danny Cole, who seemed to do whatever needed doing and couldn't have been older than 19. They filed in from the bunkhouse in the way of men who had learned not to expect much, some of them, not even taking off their hats. At first, the kind of habituated indifference that sets in when you've been disappointed enough times. Then they saw what was on the table. It wasn't elaborate. Cornbread beans, turnip greens cooked with a little of the ham, fried onions, a pot of coffee that was actual coffee, and not the watered-down version they'd apparently been drinking for weeks. Cornbread was hot, and the beans had been seasoned properly, and the coffee was strong, and when the first man took a bite and didn't put his fork down again, the rest of them followed suit. Table got quiet in the way that a table gets quiet when people are actually eating instead of just getting through a meal. Mara stood near the kitchen doorway and watched them for a moment. She wasn't proud of herself. Exactly, pride wasn't quite the right word. She was relieved. She'd been afraid, somewhere underneath the practical calculations, that she'd lost the ability to do this right. That the last 6 months had taken something from her that she wouldn't be able to get back. But watching these men eat, she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Nathan Caldwell came in late, after most of the men had already started. He sat at the end of the table, and someone passed him a plate. He didn't say anything, he ate. And at some point during the meal, he looked up at Mara in the kitchen doorway, and something passed across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, or not just gratitude. More like recognition, as if he'd been looking for something for a long time and hadn't known he'd found it. She went back into the kitchen and started on the dishes. Clara was washing. Owen was drying badly. Bess had fallen asleep sitting against the wall with her head on her folded arms, which was where she tended to end up at the end of a long day. Mara looked at her daughter sleeping in the corner of a stranger's kitchen and thought, this will do. Not forever, not necessarily, but for now this will do. She didn't know yet what was hiding in the ledger books on the sideboard in the main room. She didn't know about the papers Pete had been told to keep locked away, or about the visits Walter Briggs made to the ranch on the first Monday of every month, or about the look on Danny Cole's face whenever those visits happened, that particular tight-eyed, held-breath look of a young man who knows something he wishes he didn't. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was the weight of the cast-iron pan in her hand, the sound of her children, the warmth coming off the stove, and for the first night in 6 months, that was enough. The second day started before light. Mara had slept in the wagon with the children, huddled under everything they owned, and she'd woken at 4:30 out of habit, the old ranch wife habit that never left you, no matter how much changed. She'd built a fire in the kitchen stove before anyone else was up, and by the time the first men started moving in the bunkhouse, there was oatmeal on, and the coffee was already done. She was scrubbing the cornmeal pot when Danny Cole came through the kitchen door. He was 19. She'd guessed correctly, maybe 20, but the kind of young that still showed in the way he held himself, a slight uncertainty in his shoulders even when he was moving with purpose. He was bringing in firewood without being asked, which told her something about the kind of person he was. He stacked it near the stove and then stood there for a moment, the way people do when they have something to say and aren't sure whether they should say it. That was the best meal we've had in a month, he said finally. It wasn't much, Mara said. It was the best we'd had, he said, which is different from whether it was much. She looked at him sideways. That's a smart distinction. He shrugged, not quite comfortable with the compliment, and started toward the door. Danny, she said. He stopped. Where does Mr. Caldwell keep the garden records? He turned back, and something shifted in his face, not alarm exactly, but a kind of heightened attention. The garden records? I need to know what was planted last season and what the yield was, so I know what I'm working with come spring. Kitchen garden out back, somebody planted it, which means somebody kept track of what worked. The tension in his face eased. That'd be in the household ledgers, I think. You'd have to ask Mr. Caldwell or Pete. All right, she said. Thank you. He left. But she noticed he paused just outside the door as if making sure she really meant what she'd asked about, and not something else. She meant the garden. For now, she meant the garden. But she had seen the ledger books. She had seen the side they were stacked too many of them for a ranch this size, some of them newer than they should have been, with covers that hadn't yellowed the way books yellowed when they sat in the same place for years. She had noticed things like that her whole life, the small discrepancies that other people's eyes slid past, and she had learned that small discrepancies, left unexamined, had a habit of growing into very large problems. She wasn't ready to examine anything yet. She had a kitchen to stabilize, a pantry to build up, a winter to prepare for. The ranch needed food more urgently than it needed anyone asking questions. She had noticed. That was enough for now. By the end of the first week, the kitchen had become something the men actually looked forward to. It wasn't just the food, though the food was the beginning of it. Consistency. There was coffee ready at 5 every morning. There was a hot meal at noon if you came in from the range in time, and if you didn't, there was something left covered on the stove. Dinner at 6. No exceptions, no excuses, no apologies for what was or wasn't available, just food. Made well, made reliably, every single day. Men who have been fed unreliably for a long time, who have come in cold and hungry to find nothing, or cold porridge, or burnt biscuits made by someone who was just as miserable as they were. Those men change when consistency returns. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small ways. Someone takes their hat off at the table without being reminded. Someone holds a door. Someone says thank you and means it. Mara noticed these small changes the same way she noticed everything else. She didn't remark on them. She just kept cooking. Nathan came into the kitchen on Thursday of the first week, mid-afternoon, when the men were out and the kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of something simmering on the stove. Stood in the doorway for a moment, and Mara kept working. "Settling in all right?" he said. "Well enough," she said. The men see me paused. Different. She glanced at him. Then what? Then they were. She turned back to the stove. People generally do better when they're eating properly. It's not complicated. There was a brief silence. Then Nathan said, "The room in the back of the smokehouse, it's not much, but it's got a floor and a roof and a door that locks. You and your children shouldn't be sleeping in a wagon in October." Mara stopped what she was doing. She turned to look at him. He was standing with his arms crossed, which might have been defensive, or might have just been cold. It was hard to tell with him. His face was doing that controlled thing again. "That's kind of you," she said. "Practical," he said, which was not quite the same thing, and she suspected he knew it. "A sick cook doesn't help anyone." She almost smiled. "No," she said. "I suppose not." They moved their things into the smokehouse room that evening. It smelled like wood smoke and aged meat, which was not unpleasant. There was one window. There was a stove. Clara declared it better than the last 3 places they'd lived, which wasn't hard to believe. Owen found a cat. The cat apparently lived in the barn and had no particular name, but it followed Owen into the smokehouse and stayed curling up near the stove as if this had always been the arrangement. Mara decided not to fight it. She had bigger things to think about. The first Monday of the second week, Walter Briggs came to Silver Creek Ranch. Mara was in the kitchen when she heard the horse come into the yard. Not 1 horse, 3. Because Walter Briggs did not travel anywhere alone. She heard Pete's voice, and then a voice she didn't recognize, smooth and too loud at the same time, the voice of a man used to filling rooms. She looked through the kitchen window. He was not physically imposing. Medium height, well-dressed for this part of Montana, with a coat that cost more than most ranch hands made in 3 months. He had a round face and small eyes, and the posture of a man who had never been required to back down from anything in his life. 2 men flanked him, not cowboys. Something harder, the kind of hired men who were not hired for their skills with cattle. Pete was walking him toward the house. His body language was wrong. That was the first thing Mara registered. Pete Hollis was a man who moved through the world with a foreman's authority, a man who gave orders and had them followed, and watching him walk beside Walter Briggs, he looked smaller than he was. Not frightened exactly. Careful. The way you are around something you know can bite. Mara went back to the stove and said nothing. 20 minutes later, she heard raised voices from the main room. Not clear enough to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. One voice steady and cold, one voice tighter and faster, working too hard. She recognized Nathan's voice as the second one. She recognized the other voice as Briggs. Danny Cole came into the kitchen while this was happening. He came in for what was ostensibly a cup of coffee, but he stood near the window rather than the stove, and he was listening. Mara poured him the coffee without comment. "Who is he?" she said quietly. Danny wrapped both hands around the cup. He didn't look at her. "Walter Briggs owns the Garrison Bank. He holds Mr. Caldwell's paper," she said. "The loans, the notes, the debts." He paused, all of it. Mara thought about the ledger books. The ones that were too new, the ones that were stacked wrong. "How long?" she said. Danny looked at her then, and in his face she saw something she recognized, not just reluctance, but fear, the particular fear of someone who had learned that knowing the wrong thing and saying the wrong thing were roughly equally dangerous. Long enough, he said, and went back to looking out the window. She didn't push him. Not yet. But later that afternoon, when Nathan came into the kitchen with a face that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who had just spent an hour clenching his jaw, she set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "You don't have to." "Drink the coffee," she said. He drank the coffee. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who are both tired and both practical, who understand that some things don't need words right away. After a while, Nathan said, "The ranch has debts." "Most ranches do," Mara said, "more than it should." He was looking at the table. "My father borrowed against the land in '78, when prices were high and everything looked like it would keep going. Then they didn't. He kept borrowing." He paused. "He died before he could tell me how much. And Briggs holds the notes. Briggs holds everything." Something moved across his face, not anger, not yet. Something more like exhaustion with an edge to it. "Comes every month. He's been accommodating. So far." Mara heard what he didn't say. So far. Accommodating. So far. "Can I see the ledger books?" she said. Nathan looked at her. "Why?" "Because I was a ranch wife for 9 years." She said, "And my husband died, owing money that I didn't know existed. And I have wondered every day since then whether I would have seen it coming if I'd been paying attention. I pay attention now." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking to run your business. I'm asking to look at the numbers." Nathan studied her for a long moment. Then he got up, went to the sideboard, and came back with 3 of the ledger books. Put them on the table in front of her. She opened the first one. It took her 3 evenings. She worked after the children were asleep, by lamplight, with a piece of paper and a pencil, checking the figures column by column. She was not an accountant. She had never been to school past the age of 14. But she had managed a household and a ranch budget for nearly a decade, and numbers, in her experience, were like kitchens. They had a logic to them, a pattern, and when something broke the pattern, left a mark if you knew what you were looking at. The first ledger looked reasonable. Loans, payments, interest, the kind of debt that built up slowly and made sense, the kind her husband's family had managed for generations. Painful but comprehensible. The second ledger was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong you'd see at a glance. But wrong in the way that a wobbly table leg is wrong. You might not notice it for weeks, and then you put something heavy on it, and suddenly it matters very much. There were notes she couldn't match to any transaction she found elsewhere. Payments for amounts that didn't correspond to any loans she could identify. Interest calculations that didn't match the rate listed at the top of the page. She checked her arithmetic twice, 3 times. On the 3rd evening, she found the signature. It was on a promissory note dated 3 years back, a note that committed Nathan Caldwell, or someone signing as Nathan Caldwell, to a debt of $4,000 with terms that were, as far as she could tell, designed to be impossible to meet. The interest compounded in a way that most people wouldn't catch, unless they sat down and did the math carefully. And the signature she had seen, Nathan's signature on the household accounts. She'd been looking at it for 2 weeks. This was not the same signature. The letters were similar, someone had practiced, but the way Nathan formed his capital C was distinctive, a particular way of pulling the pen back before completing the curve, and this signature didn't have it. This signature had been written by someone who was copying from something, not writing from habit. Mara sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. She looked at the note. She looked at the date. She looked at the amount. $4,000, compounding at a rate that would make the debt nearly double in 5 years, attached to a signature that Nathan Caldwell had never written. Closed the ledger book carefully. She went to the small window and looked out at the ranch yard. It was dark, and she could see the light in the main house, and the dimmer light from the bunkhouse, and the shapes of the mountains against the sky. She thought about the 2 men who had come with Walter Briggs, the ones who were not hired for their skills with cattle. She thought about Danny Cole's face when she'd asked him how long. She thought about Nathan saying, "He's been accommodating," and the way he'd said it. She went back to the table and opened the ledger again. She was not going to misread this. She was not going to decide she understood something she didn't. She was going to be sure. She started from the beginning of the second ledger and went through it again, slower this time, writing down every figure that didn't add up, every note she couldn't trace, every signature that might have been wrong. By midnight, she had filled 2 pages. She sat back and looked at what she'd written. Silver Creek Ranch was not drowning in its own debt. Silver Creek Ranch was being drowned, carefully, deliberately, by someone who had spent years building a case that couldn't easily be challenged because the evidence was all in paper, and the paper was all in the bank. And the man who held the bank was the same man who came riding in on the first Monday of every month, with 2 hired men flanking him, and a face full of patience that wasn't patience at all. Mara folded her 2 pages of notes and put them in the pocket of her apron. Then she got up, banked the stove for the night, checked on her children, and lay down on her bedroll. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, her breathing was steady. She had seen the shape of the problem now. That was the first thing. You had to see the shape before you could decide what to do about it. She had decided to be brave enough to look. Now she would have to decide how brave she was willing to be. She did not bring it to Nathan the next morning. She thought about it standing at the stove at 5 a.m., listening to the ranch wake up around her, the sounds of boots on frozen ground and horses in the corral, and men talking in low voices the way men do before they're fully awake. She thought about walking across the yard with her 2 pages of notes and putting them on the table in front of him and saying, "Someone has been forging your signature, and you are being robbed in a way that looks entirely legal." She didn't do it, not because she doubted what she'd found. She'd checked the numbers 4 times now, and the numbers did not lie. She didn't do it because Nathan Caldwell was a man who was already carrying more weight than he showed, and because she had learned, in 9 years of marriage and 6 months of surviving on her own, that bringing a person a problem before you had even the beginning of an answer was a particular kind of cruelty. You handed someone a fire and no water. What were they supposed to do with that? She needed something more than 2 pages of arithmetic. She needed to understand the full shape of it before she showed anyone anything. So she cooked breakfast. She fed 22 men. She noted, without making it obvious, that Danny Cole was quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. There was something specific in it this morning, a tightness around his jaw, a way of looking at the door rather than at anything in the room. After the breakfast dishes were done, she went looking for the rest of the ledgers. Pete kept his records in the foreman's office, a small room off the barn that smelled like leather and hay and old coffee. She knocked. He wasn't in. She pushed the door open and stood in the threshold looking at the shelves. She was not a thief. She was not looking for anything that didn't belong to her to look at. She was a woman who had recently discovered that a powerful man had been quietly dismantling a family's future using paper and ink and the patience of someone who knew no one would check. And she had decided, somewhere in the sleepless middle of the previous night, that not checking was no longer an option she was willing to take. She found what she was looking for on the second shelf, a ledger older than the ones in the main house, its spine worn and its pages soft with handling. This was the original ranch record, the one from before Nathan's father had started borrowing. And she could tell it was the original, because the handwriting inside was different from everything else older. More careful, the handwriting of a man who had built something from nothing and wanted a record of every piece of it. She sat down on Pete's chair and started reading. It took her 2 hours. Pete came back once and found her there, and he stopped in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. Mr. Caldwell said, "I could look at the records," Mara said without looking up. This was true, in the sense that he had given her 3 ledgers and not specified which ones. It was the kind of true that she would have to account for later, and she knew it. "I'm trying to understand what the ranch's actual obligations are, separate from what Briggs is claiming." Pete came in and sat on the edge of the work table, crossed his arms. He was looking at the ledger in her hands with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between discomfort and something like relief, as if he'd been waiting for someone to do this particular thing and hadn't been able to do it himself. "And," he said, "the original debt is manageable," she said. "Painful but manageable. What's in the newer book?" She paused. "Pete, did you ever read those notes carefully? The ones from the last 3 years?" He was quiet for a moment. "I do the livestock records," he said. "Financial was always Nathan's father, and then Nathan. But you've seen Briggs's paperwork. I've seen some of it. Did Nathan sign all of it in front of you?" Another silence. Longer this time. Pete uncrossed and recrossed his arms, which was the most uncomfortable she'd seen him since she'd arrived. "Not all of it," he said finally. "Some of it was already signed when Briggs brought it. He said Nathan had come into the bank and done it there." Mara looked at him. She watched him understand what she was not quite saying. His face went through several things in quick succession: doubt, then the resistance to doubt that people have when they've believed something was a certain way for a long time, Then something harder and colder that settled underneath. "You're sure," he said. "Not a question." "I need a lawyer to be sure," she said. "I need someone who knows what a forged signature looks like under the law and what can be done about it. I'm a cook who does arithmetic, not a legal expert. The numbers don't match, Pete. The signatures don't match. And if I'm right about this, then Nathan doesn't owe Briggs anything like what Briggs says he does." Pete stared at the floor for a long moment. "If you're wrong," he said slowly, "and you take this somewhere and you're wrong, Briggs will bury this ranch. He has the ear of every banker and judge in 3 counties. "I know," Mara said, "and if you're right," Pete said, "Briggs will still try to bury this ranch. Because men like that don't go quietly." "I know that, too," she said. She put the old ledger back on the shelf and stood up. "I'm not asking you to do anything yet. I'm asking you not to say anything to anyone until I've had time to think about how to approach this carefully." Pete looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, in the way he hadn't quite done when she'd first arrived, when she'd been just a widow with 3 children and no obvious use beyond the kitchen. "All right," he said. "I can do that." She went back to the kitchen. She had bread to make and a soup that needed another hour, and she stood at the work table and worked with her hands, while her mind went somewhere else entirely, building and rebuilding the shape of what she knew against the shape of what she needed. She found Danny Cole that afternoon, near the horse corral. He was mending a section of fence, methodical and quiet, the kind of work that could be done without thinking, which meant his mind was probably somewhere else the same way hers had been all morning. She came up beside him and picked up the other end of the wire without being asked, holding it in place so he could work it through the post. He glanced at her, but didn't say anything. They worked for a few minutes in silence. Then Mara said, "How long have you been at Silver Creek?" 2 years, near enough. "You were here when the second wave of Briggs's notes started coming in." Then Danny's hand slowed for just a fraction of a second. Then they kept moving. "I do fence work," he said, "and whatever else Pete needs." "I know," Mara said, "but you watch things. You're the kind of person who notices things and doesn't say so." "Quiet. Danny," she said, "I've looked at the ledgers. I've seen the numbers. I've seen the signatures." She waited a beat. "I know you know something. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I'm asking you to tell me what you know so I can decide what's possible." He looked at the fence post for a long time. The wind came off the mountains and moved through the dry grass in the lower pasture, and everything was very still otherwise. "Last spring," he said finally, "I had to ride into Garrison for supplies. I went by the bank to pick up a receipt that Pete had asked for, just a simple piece of paper. Nothing important. The clerk gave me the wrong envelope by mistake. He realized it right away and took it back, but I'd already looked at it." He paused. It was a note dated 4 months earlier, signed with Mr. Caldwell's name, for $3,800. "And you knew Nathan hadn't signed it," Mara said. "I didn't know anything," Danny said, and his voice had a rawness in it that was not quite anger and not quite fear. "I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe he had signed it and just hadn't told Pete. It wasn't my business. I'm a ranch hand." "But you didn't stop thinking about it." "No," he said, "I didn't stop thinking about it." He drove a fence staple with more force than it required. "A couple months later, I went back to look at something in the barn storage. Pete had asked me to get some old survey records that were kept in a box near the back. I found something that shouldn't have been there. A piece of paper with Nathan's signature on it, practiced. Lots of times. Same name over and over, like someone was..." He stopped. "Practicing," Mar said. "Yeah. Where was this paper?" Danny looked at her then, and she could see the weight of it in his face, the weight of having carried this alone for months, of not having known who to trust, or whether trusting anyone was safe. "I don't know who put it there," he said, "and I don't know what happened to it after, because I put it back where I found it, and it was gone the next week." "Told Nathan." "I tried," Danny said, and his jaw tightened. "Once, about 2 months ago, I asked to speak with him privately. I said there was something in the financial records that I thought he should look at. Briggs was in the main house having his monthly visit. One of his men came out of the barn right when I was talking to Nathan. He said nothing, didn't threaten me directly, just stood there. And Nathan said we'd talk later, and later never came." He paused. "The week after that, I got jumped coming back from the south pasture. 2 men. I never saw their faces. They broke 2 of my ribs and told me I was clumsy and should watch where I was going." Mara went still. She had heard of this kind of thing. She had understood, intellectually, that Walter Briggs was not just a banker with questionable bookkeeping practices. But hearing it plainly, 2 men, broken ribs, a warning dressed as an accident, made the thing real in a way that cold arithmetic did not. Are you all right now? She said. Danny seemed surprised by the question. Well enough. That was 8 weeks ago. And you haven't said anything since. I have a mother in Billings, he said quietly. I send her money every month. If I lose this job, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mara looked out at the pasture. The afternoon light was going golden flat, the way it did in Montana in October, and the mountains were sitting hard and purple against the sky. You're not going to lose your job, she said. You don't know that. Not yet, she said. But I'm working on it. She left him at the fence and went back to start dinner. She told Nathan that night. She waited until after the men had eaten, and the kitchen was clean, and the children were in the smokehouse room. Then she went to the main house and knocked on the door. And when he opened it, she walked past him to the table without waiting to be invited and laid out her 2 pages of notes, and the relevant pages she'd flagged in the ledgers, and a third sheet she'd written out that afternoon, a plain accounting, as clear as she could make it, of what the numbers actually said versus what Briggs claimed they said. Nathan stood at the edge of the table and looked at the papers. He did not sit down. Mara waited. After a while, he pulled out a chair and sat. He pulled the first page toward him and read it, then the second. Then he looked at the flagged pages in the ledgers, going back and forth between them and her arithmetic sheet. She sat across from him and said nothing. She let him read. She let him think. It took a long time. When he looked up, his face was controlled in the way she was coming to understand, as his particular response to things that threatened to crack him open. He went very still, very careful, as if sudden movement might break something. You're saying these notes were forged, he said. I'm saying the signatures don't match yours, she said, and the figures don't correspond to any transactions I can find in the original records. Could be wrong. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a banker. But I'm not wrong about the signatures, Nathan. You pull the pen back before you finish the C. Every time, it's a habit. Whoever signed these documents was copying a signature on paper. They didn't have that habit. He looked at his own signature on the household accounts for a long moment. Then he looked at the signature on the forged note. She watched something move through him, not surprise exactly. More like something that had been formless becoming specific. The way a shape appears when enough light hits it at the right angle. I have felt, he said slowly, for about 2 years, that the numbers were wrong. That what Briggs told me I owed didn't match what I thought I'd borrowed. He paused. I thought I was miscounting. I thought my father had made agreements he hadn't told me about. I thought. He stopped. He pressed his hand flat against the table. Kept thinking I was wrong. You weren't wrong, Marissa said. No, he looked at the papers. No, I wasn't wrong. The silence in the room was different from any silence that had existed in it before. It was a silence with weight and direction, the kind that meant the ground had shifted, and both people knew it. What do I do with this? Nathan said. First thing, Mara said, is you don't do anything in a hurry. Men like Briggs have had a long time to build this, and it's going to take careful, documented, legal work to dismantle it. Panic will make mistakes. Mistakes will give him what he needs to come back harder. Nathan looked at her. How do you know how to think about this? Because I watched my husband do the opposite, she said, and I watched what happened. She said it without flinching, without looking away. Panicked. He made mistakes. He owed less than Briggs claims you owe, and it still cost us everything. Nathan held her gaze. Then he nodded once slowly. All right, he said. What's the first thing? A lawyer, she said. Not one from Garrison. Someone from Helena or Billings, somewhere Briggs's influence doesn't reach. Someone who knows document law and can look at these signatures with professional eyes. That takes money, Nathan said. I know. She looked at him steadily. How much can you put your hands on without going through the bank? He was quiet for a moment, calculating, maybe $300. I've kept some cash separate, an old habit my father had. Money that didn't go through any books. 300 might be enough to start, Mara said. Enough to get someone out here to look at what we have. If a lawyer looks at this and says I'm reading the signatures wrong, then we know something different. But if they agree, she paused. Then we have something we can take to a territorial court. Nathan was quiet. He was looking at the papers again, but his mind was clearly somewhere beyond them. There's something else, Mara said. He looked up. She told him about Danny, about the practice signatures in the barn storage, about the men who had broken his ribs, about the warning that had been delivered without words. She watched Nathan's face go through something complicated as she spoke. Not surprised. Exactly more like a man who had been given the last piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. Danny, he said quietly. When she finished, He's afraid, she said, and his fear is reasonable. He's alone. He has no protection, and the people who hurt him have already shown they're willing to do it again. I should have, Nathan started. You didn't know, Mara said. Now you do. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I'll talk to him. Talk to him, she agreed. But also make sure he knows this isn't going to fall on him. Whatever happens next, Danny's not going to be the one holding it alone. Nathan looked at her across the table, and for a moment, the careful control in his face slipped just slightly, not into weakness, but into something more direct than he usually allowed himself. Why are you doing this? He said. You're a cook. This isn't, he stopped. This isn't your fight. Mara thought about that for a moment. My husband died owing money he didn't actually owe, she said. Not because anyone forged his signature, but because someone with more resources and more knowledge than he had structured things, so they worked against him, and he never understood what was happening until it was too late. I lost my house, my children lost their home, and every day since then I have thought about what would have been different if someone had sat down with those documents and paid attention. She paused. This is not my fight in the sense that I own anything here, but it is absolutely my fight in every other sense. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said finally. We do this carefully. We do it right. Yes, Mara said. She gathered her papers, left him the flagged ledgers, and went back to the smokehouse. She lay down in the dark and listened to her children breathe and stared at the ceiling. Nathan spoke to Danny the next morning early, before the rest of the men were up. Mara saw them from the kitchen window, Nathan and Danny in the yard. Nathan doing most of the talking, Danny listening with his arms crossed and his head slightly down. At one point, Nathan put his hand on the younger man's shoulder, briefly the way a person does, when they mean something that isn't easily said. Danny looked up. Something passed between them, and it was not comfortable. There was too much history in it, too much of Danny's carefully maintained silence, too much of Nathan's obliviousness, but it was honest. And honest was the most important thing right now. When Danny came into the kitchen for breakfast, he looked like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. He didn't look relieved exactly. Relief would come later, if it came at all. He looked like a person whose burden had at least become shared. Thank you, he said quietly to Mara, pouring his coffee. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't done anything. Still, he said. She let it go. That week, Nathan wrote a letter to a lawyer in Helena named Eustace Cavett, a man Pete knew of through a cousin who had used him in a land dispute 2 years prior. The letter was carefully vague, a question about document verification, framed as a routine matter, and it went out with the Thursday mail rider. Mara kept cooking. She kept the kitchen running the way she always had, on schedule, on budget, with the steady logic of someone who understood that the daily sustenance of the people around her was not separate from the larger thing they were trying to do. It was the same thing. A ranch full of hungry, demoralized men could not mount any kind of sustained effort at anything. A ranch full of men who were eating well, who had come to trust that there was someone in the kitchen who was paying attention, that was something different. She noticed the change in the men in small daily ways. There was less of the dull quiet she'd found when she arrived, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but is just the absence of hope. Men talked at the table now. They argued about cattle prices and argued about weather, and occasionally argued about things that had nothing to do with ranch work. A book one of them had been reading, a card game that had gone wrong 2 weeks ago, whether the mountains got more snow in November or December. She noticed, too, that they had started watching out for things without being asked. One of the older hands had fixed the broken barn door without anyone assigning it to him. The firewood that had been left out and gotten wet was now covered properly. Someone had fixed the fence post near the gate, the leaning one she had noticed on the very first day. Small things. The kind of things that only happen when people have decided somewhere in themselves that a place is worth maintaining. Mara noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. She also continued going through the ledgers. It had become, in the early morning hours before anyone else was up, her second occupation, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp and the papers, and her careful notes, tracing the shape of Briggs's operation back through time. The more she looked, the more it became clear that Silver Creek Ranch was not the only target. There were references in the records, oblique ones, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking closely, to other properties, other families, other debts that had passed through Garrison Bank over the past decade. She started making a separate list. She didn't know yet what she would do with it, but she wrote down every name she found, every property, every transaction, that smelled the same way the Silver Creek transactions smelled. The Miles family, south of town. The Hartley claim, which she remembered the baker in Garrison mentioning in passing as having been sold to the bank last spring, for reasons nobody could quite explain. A man named Aldous Burke, who had owned a cattle operation northeast of the river, and apparently no longer did. Name by name, date by date, figure by figure, the list grew. Eustace Cavitt's reply arrived on a Friday afternoon, 2.5 weeks after Nathan's letter had gone out. Nathan brought it to the kitchen rather than the main house, which told Mara something about where things stood between them now. He sat at the kitchen table and read it twice, before sliding it across to her. Cavitt's handwriting was economical and precise. The handwriting of a man who had learned that clarity was the most useful quality a document could have. Confirmed that he had handled several cases involving disputed signatures and fraudulent debt instruments in the Montana Territory over the past 8 years. He said that if the situation was as Nathan had described, it was possible, he was careful to say, only possible that what Nathan had was grounds for a legal challenge. He would need to examine the original documents in person. He could be at Silver Creek Ranch in 3 weeks. If Nathan could send his retainer fee of $75 by return post, $75. A significant bite out of Nathan's $300, but not a crippling one. Send it, Mara said. Nathan looked at her. Send it, she said again. If Cavitt looks at the documents and says you have nothing, you'll have spent $75 to know that for certain. Certain 'tis worth something. Nathan folded the letter. He sent the retainer with the Monday mail rider. The second Monday of November, Walter Briggs came again. Mara heard him arrive the same way. She always heard him arrive 3 horses, too loud for what the occasion required. The sound of a man who performed his authority rather than simply having it. Stayed in the kitchen. She had learned in the weeks since she'd begun this careful work to be invisible when Briggs was at the ranch. Not because she was afraid of him, though she had a healthy respect for what he was capable of, but because she understood that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was let him know she existed in any capacity beyond cook. She heard him in the main room. She heard his voice, the smooth, too loud one, and she heard Nathan's voice, and she began to understand, listening from the kitchen, that something was different today. Briggs was not making ordinary small talk about the month's interest. He was asking questions, careful questions, the kind that were looking for something specific. He asked about whether Nathan had been in contact with anyone outside of Garrison regarding the ranch's finances. He asked about whether Nathan had recently reviewed any of the formal documentation. He asked, and this was the one that made Mara stop entirely and stand very still. He asked whether Nathan had hired any new people recently and what their responsibilities were. Nathan's voice remained even. He said yes, he'd hired a cook. He said she was a widow from out east. He said she did the kitchen and nothing else. A pause. Good cook, Briggs said. The men aren't complaining, Nathan said. Briggs laughed. It was the laugh of a man who found things amusing for reasons other people weren't privy to. Then he went back to the business of the monthly payment, and Mara went back to stirring the pot on the stove, and her hand was steady, and she made sure of that. When Briggs left 20 minutes later, she listened to the 3 horses crossing the yard. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she went to the back shelf and took down the flour canister, not for flour, but because tucked behind it, in a folded piece of cloth, was the copy she had made of her 2 pages of notes. She had put a copy here, and one in the root cellar, and one inside the cover of the family Bible she carried in her trunk, because she had understood instinctively that documentation was only safe when it existed in more than one place. She unfolded the papers and looked at them. Briggs had asked about new people. He was checking. Something had made him uneasy, she didn't know what. Whether it was Nathan's manner, or something Briggs had seen or heard through his own networks, or simply the regular caution of a man who had been running a careful crime for a long time, and knew that careful crimes required constant maintenance. She had 3 weeks before Cavitt arrived. She needed to make sure everything they had was organized, copied, and stored in places Briggs couldn't reach, before he figured out that the cook at Silver Creek Ranch was not simply a woman who made cornbread. She put the papers back. She finished the soup. She called the children in to help set the table. But her mind was moving fast and clear, the way it moved when she understood the shape of a problem completely and was working out, step by step, what came next. 3 weeks. Cavitt would look at the documents. He would confirm what she believed she already knew. And then carefully, properly, with documentation and law behind them, they would begin to pull apart everything Walter Briggs had built. She had not come to Silver Creek Ranch looking for this fight. She had come looking for a stove and a job, and somewhere her children could sleep indoors. The fight had been here when she arrived, hiding in the ledgers and in Danny's broken ribs and in the exhausted faces of 22 men who had stopped expecting things to get better. She had not started it. She intended, however, to finish it. Just Cavett arrived on a Tuesday, which was not the day he was expected. He sent no advance word of the change, just rode up to the Silver Creek gate on a gray horse with a leather satchel tied behind the saddle and a hat that had seen better decades. And Pete brought him to the main house without ceremony. Mara saw him cross the yard from the kitchen window. He was older than she'd pictured from his handwriting, somewhere in his mid-60s, lean in the way of men who had never been much for sitting still, with a white mustache and the kind of watchful eyes that moved around a room before the rest of him settled into it. Nathan met him at the door. Mara gave them an hour. Then she put coffee and the last of the morning's biscuits on a tray and brought it across without being asked, because she had learned that lawyers, like everyone else, thought more clearly when they weren't hungry, and because she had no intention of waiting in the kitchen while the most important conversation this ranch had seen in years happened without her. Nathan looked at her when she came in. He started to say something. She set the tray on the table and sat down. There was a brief silence. Cavett looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Mara. Then Cavett picked up his coffee, leaned back in his chair, and said, "You're the cook." "I'm the person who found the discrepancies in the ledgers," she said. "Cook is how I got access to the kitchen. They're related but not the same." Cavett looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, but something like recalibration, which was similar. "All right," he said. "Show me what you found." She laid it out the same way she'd laid it out for Nathan. 3 weeks earlier, the original records, the newer ledgers, her handwritten arithmetic pages, the flagged signatures. Cavett did not interrupt. He went through each piece methodically, holding the pages close to the window light when he needed to, making small sounds under his breath that could have meant anything. When he got to the signature comparison, he stopped. He held Nathan's original household accounts in his left hand and the forged promissory note in his right. He looked back and forth between them for a long time. Then he put both documents flat on the table and produced a small magnifying glass from his coat pocket and looked at both signatures through it. The room was very quiet. "You noticed this yourself," Cavett said, without looking up. He was addressing Mara. "The capital C," she said, "pulls the pen back before he completes the curve. The forged note doesn't have that." "It doesn't," Cavett agreed. He set the magnifying glass down. "There are 3 other indicators I can see from a preliminary examination. Pen pressure is inconsistent with a person writing their own name from habit. Angle of the baseline shifts in a way that suggests copying rather than natural writing. And the spacing between letters is slightly too even, which is what happens when someone is paying close attention to forming letters rather than just signing." He paused. "I've seen enough forged documents in 30 years of practice to know one when I'm looking at it." Nathan was sitting with both hands flat on the table. "How many notes are there?" Cavett said. "We've identified 4 that we're confident about," Mara said. "There may be more in the bank's own records that we haven't seen." "The bank's records are going to be the problem," Cavett said. "Briggs controls what comes out of that building. Getting a court order to compel disclosure of his internal documents is possible, but it requires establishing probable cause first. And to establish probable cause, I need to file. And to file, I need clients who are committed to seeing this through, regardless of what Briggs throws at them." He looked at Nathan directly. "Because he will throw things. He has resources and he has connections. And the first thing he will do when he realizes you're challenging him is make your life as difficult as he possibly can." "He's already been making it difficult," Nathan said. "He's been making it manageable," Cavett said. "What I'm describing is different. He will question your character. He will call in every debt and favor and obligation he can reach. He will find people to say things about you that are not true, and some of those people will be believed." He paused. "I am telling you this not to discourage you, but because men who go into this kind of fight without understanding it tend to flinch at the wrong moment. I need to know you understand it." Nathan looked at Mara. She looked back at him. "We understand it," Nathan said. Cavett stayed 4 days. He went through every document in the house, and then the documents in Pete's office, and then, with Nathan's permission and Pete's assistance, a box of older records that had been stored in the back of the barn since Nathan's father's time. Mara kept him fed and kept the other men away from the main house during his working hours, which required a certain amount of creative redirection, but was manageable. On the evening of the second day, Cavett found something neither Mara nor Nathan had seen. It was in the oldest of the barn records a correspondence file from nearly a decade back, letters between Nathan's father, James Caldwell, and a man at the Territorial Land Office in Helena. The letters were dry and routine until the third one, which contained a phrase that Cavett read aloud at the kitchen table with the particular quiet voice of a man who had just placed the last piece of a very large puzzle. Your previous notation that the eastern parcel boundary had been resurveyed and confirmed, Cavett read, and that all corresponding documentation was filed with the county clerk in March of 1875, has been received. Please advise if any correction to the original land grant is required. Put the letter down. The eastern parcel, Nathan said. That's the grazing land along the river. About 400 acres. 400 acres that, according to the promissory note dated 1882, Cavett said, you supposedly signed over to Garrison Bank as collateral against a debt you apparently never incurred. The kitchen was very quiet. That land is in my name, Nathan said. My father's name first, then mine. I have never used it as collateral for anything. No, Cavett said. But someone has a document that says you did. And that document, if Briggs chooses to act on it, gives him legal grounds to claim 400 acres of your best grazing land as forfeited collateral the moment you miss a payment, whether or not the underlying debt is legitimate. Mara thought about the 30-day notice she'd seen Briggs put on the desk on the day she'd arrived. The easy confidence of a man who had already decided how everything would end. He was never going to wait long, she said, half to herself. No, Cavett said. I suspect the monthly visits and the patient demeanor have been deliberate. Give a man enough rope, make him feel like there's still time, and he'll be less likely to start asking the right questions before it's too late. He looked at Mara. If you hadn't found these discrepancies when you did, someone would have found them eventually, she said. Perhaps, Cavett said. Or perhaps not. It depends on whether anyone was looking. He said it without particular emphasis, but she felt the weight of it anyway. On the morning of the fourth day, Cavett sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper and laid out plainly what he believed they had and what it would cost to pursue. They had, in his opinion, sufficient evidence to file a complaint with the Territorial District Court alleging document fraud and forgery. The forged signatures were the center of it, but the collateral claim on the eastern parcel was almost equally significant because it could be challenged on the basis of the 1,875 land office correspondence, proving prior established title. If they could find other families who had been similarly defrauded, and Cavett believed, based on what Mara had told him about her own separate list of names, that such families existed, they would have grounds for a broader complaint that would be considerably harder to dismiss. The risks were real. Briggs would challenge. He would hire lawyers of his own, better resourced ones. He would attempt to discredit every witness and every document. Nathan's financial situation would be scrutinized publicly in ways that would be painful. There was no guarantee of success. But, Cavett said, the alternative is to continue as you are, which means in approximately 18 months, when the compounding on the fraudulent notes reaches the level Briggs has designed it to reach, he will have legal grounds, fraudulent legal grounds, but legally constructed ones to foreclose on this property entirely. Nathan was quiet. Pete, who had come in partway through this recitation and sat without being invited, said, "So we fight or we lose." Essentially, Cavett said. "Then we fight," Pete said. He said it the way he said most things without drama, as if it were simply the next practical step. Nathan looked at Pete, then at Mara, then back at Cavett. "What do we need?" "Copies of every document we've identified," Cavett said. "Made here, kept here, and also sent to my office in Helena for safekeeping. I want originals and copies separated in case someone attempts to interfere with the evidence." He looked at Mara when he said this. Danny Cole needs to make a formal statement. Written, witnessed, notarized. His testimony about the practice signatures in the barn is significant. "He's afraid," Mara said. "I know," Cavett said. "Fears is reasonable. But a man's testimony becomes considerably more valuable when it's on paper with a notary's seal, because at that point, destroying it requires more than just intimidating the man." He paused. "Tell him that. Tell him that putting it on paper is actually what protects him, not the other way around." That afternoon, Mara found Danny at the south fence. Again, he seemed to come back to the same stretch of fence, the way some people come back to a particular chair when they're thinking. She stood beside him and repeated what Cavett had said, as plainly as she could. Danny listened. His hands kept moving on the wire. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. If Briggs finds out before the case is filed, he said. Cavett is going to move quickly, Mara said. Once the complaint is filed, Briggs loses the element of surprise. Right now he doesn't know what we have. That won't last. But right now it's just our word against his. Right now, she said, we have forged signatures, fraudulent notes, a land claim that contradicts documented title, and a lawyer who has spent 30 years handling exactly this kind of case. She looked at him. It's not just our word. We have paper, we have numbers. We have his own documents working against him. Danny stared at the fence post for a long moment. Then he said, if I do this, if I put it in writing, I need to know that it's going somewhere. That it's not just going to disappear into some courthouse and nothing happens. Can't promise you nothing will go wrong, Mara said. I won't insult you by pretending this is without risk. But I can promise you that Cavett is not a man who takes cases he doesn't believe in, and he believes in this one. And I can promise you that Nathan is committed, and Pete is committed, and I am committed, and that we are not going to stop. He looked at her. People say that, he said. People say they're committed right up until it gets hard. Yes, she said. They do. And then you find out which ones meant it. She held his gaze and didn't look away. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite resignation, but somewhere between. All right, he said. I'll give the statement. Cavett left on a Friday with a satchel full of copied documents and a list of the other families Mara had identified, and a promise to file the formal complaint within 2 weeks. He shook Nathan's hand at the gate and nodded to Pete, and then he looked at Mara and said, You have good instincts and better arithmetic. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She nodded once. He rode out. The ranch felt different in the days after Cavett left, not lighter exactly. More like a place that had made a decision and was now living inside it. There was a tension that hadn't been there before, but it was a different kind of tension from the dull exhaustion she'd found when she arrived. This was the tension of people who were waiting for something they had set in motion, which was better than the tension of people who were waiting for something they had no control over. Mara kept cooking. She kept her notes hidden in 3 different locations. She went to bed every night running through what she knew and what she still didn't know and what the gaps might mean. 3 things happened in the 2 weeks that followed, and none of them were the things she expected. The first was that one of the men on her list, a rancher named Frank Miles, whose family property south of town had been the first name she'd written down, rode out to Silver Creek unannounced on a Wednesday morning. He was a big man in his 50s, with a grievance that had been sitting in him long enough to ferment into something harder than anger. He'd heard, through the particular small-town telegraph of people who talked to people who talked to people, that someone at Silver Creek had started asking questions about Garrison Bank. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and told Mara, because she was the one who answered the door, that 2 years ago Briggs had foreclosed on 80 acres of his family's land, using a debt instrument that Frank had never signed, and that he had gone to the county clerk and the county sheriff, and both had told him he had no case, and that he had spent the last year believing they were right. Mara poured him more coffee and said, You were not wrong to doubt them. Tell me everything you remember. The second thing was that someone went through the main house, while Nathan and Pete were out on the East Range, and all the ranch hands were at work. Nothing was taken as far as they could tell, but the ledger books had been moved not far, just enough to know that someone had looked at them. Mara noticed immediately because she noticed where things were. She went and checked her 3 copies of the documents. They were untouched. She told Nathan that evening. He stood in the middle of the main room, looking at the ledgers, and his jaw went tight. He's checking, he said. Yes. He knows something. Expects something, Mara said. If he knew for certain, he wouldn't be checking. He'd already be moving, she paused. But he will be moving soon. We need to be ready. The third thing was that Briggs himself came out on a Thursday, not the first Monday of the month, not on schedule. Came alone, which was the thing that made Mara's stomach tighten. When she heard the single horse in the yard alone meant he wasn't performing today, wasn't making a show of force. Alone meant this was something more careful than that. She stayed in the kitchen. She could hear him through the wall. It was pleasant. That was the first thing. It was pleasant in a specific, deliberate way, the way a man is pleasant when he is looking for something and doesn't want you to know he's looking. He talked about the winter coming in and the cattle market and a couple of things about the Garrison Merchants Association that had nothing to do with anything. And then, casually, he mentioned that he'd heard Nathan had been in correspondence with a lawyer in Helena. The way he said it, it was almost nothing, almost a pleasantry, just a thing he'd happened to hear. Nathan said he consulted lawyers occasionally on routine matters. Briggs said, of course, of course. He said it was always wise to keep good legal counsel. He said that he himself relied heavily on his own lawyers in Missoula. Very good men, very thorough, he said, and this was the part that reached through the kitchen wall and found Mara's spine that he did want to mention, purely as a gesture of goodwill, that any legal action related to the ranch's debt obligations would likely trigger a clause in the original loan agreements requiring immediate payment in full of all outstanding amounts. Nathan's voice, when he responded, was careful and even. He thanked Briggs for the information. Briggs left. Mara stood at the stove for a moment after she heard the horse cross the yard. Then she put down the spoon she was holding and went to the main house. Nathan was standing exactly where he'd been standing the day she'd arrived, and looked through the window at the desk, looking at papers. His hands were braced on the surface and his head was down. He's accelerating, she said. Yes, he knows we've talked to a lawyer. He doesn't know what Cavett has, but he's guessing. She came to stand beside the desk. We have to contact Cavett today. He needs to file now, not in 2 weeks. If Briggs has a clause that triggers immediate repayment, we need to be inside a formal legal proceeding before he activates it. Because once a case is before the court, that kind of pressure tactic becomes much harder to use cleanly. Nathan looked at her. Can we send a writer today? It needs to go today, Mara said. Frank Miles will testify. I need you to send word to him as well so he's prepared. And I need you to talk to Danny tonight. Because whatever happens next, his statement needs to be notarized before Briggs makes his next move. Nathan nodded. He was already moving, already pulling on his coat. Pete, he said, raising his voice. Pete appeared from the back hallway. He had clearly been listening. I'll ride to Miles myself, he said. My horse is faster than sending a regular rider. Go, Nathan said. Mara, write out what you need Cavett to know. I'll have it ready for the mail rider in an hour. She went back to the kitchen, sat at the table, and wrote. She wrote carefully, not everything, not the details that didn't need to be in a letter that could be intercepted, but enough. She wrote that the timeline had changed, that the opposing party was aware of the legal consultation, that immediate filing was necessary. She wrote down the acceleration clause Briggs had mentioned, word for word as she had heard it through the wall, and she noted the date and time of the visit. She folded the letter and sealed it and brought it to Nathan. He looked at the seal, then he looked at her. How are you this calm, he said. Thought about that honestly. I'm not calm, she said. I'm just managing. He almost smiled at that, a small, tired thing that didn't quite reach everywhere it was trying to reach. There's a difference? Not much of one, she admitted. He took the letter. Danny's notarized statement was done by Sunday. Mara had found the notary herself, a woman named Grace Elliott, who ran the dry goods store in 12 miles east of Garrison, and who had a notary commission that had nothing to do with Walter Briggs or anyone connected to him. She'd ridden out to find her on Saturday, taking Clara with her, because she didn't want to leave the children entirely alone on the ranch. Grace Elliott was a small, sharp-faced woman of about 50 who listened to Mara's explanation with her arms crossed and then said simply, "Bring the boy and I'll do it tomorrow morning." Danny rode out Sunday before church time and gave his statement in Grace Elliott's back room, with Mara sitting beside him and Clara reading a book in the corner. He was nervous. His hands were not entirely steady. But he spoke clearly and he didn't leave anything out. And at the end of it, Grace Elliott pressed her seal into the paper and signed her name beneath it. And Danny looked at the document for a moment. That's it, he said. That's it, Grace said. You want a copy for yourself? Yes, Mara said before Danny could answer either way. He rode back to Silver Creek with a notarized statement and a copy in his coat pocket. That evening, Mara added a third copy to the root cellar with the other documents. She did not feel safe. She was not foolish enough to feel safe. But she felt, for the first time since Cavett had left, that they had done everything they could do with what they had, and that what they had was more than nothing. Cavett's response to the accelerated timeline arrived 8 days later. He had filed. The complaint was before the Territorial District Court as of the previous Wednesday, which meant it had been filed the day after he received Nathan's letter, which meant Eustace Cavett was either very fast or had already anticipated needing to move quickly. Mara suspected the latter. He had spent 30 years practicing law in a territory where men like Briggs were not rare, and he knew what a cornered opponent looked like. Complaint alleged document fraud, forgery of signatures on financial instruments, and unlawful collateral claims against titled land. It named Walter Briggs personally and Garrison Bank as an institution. It listed Nathan Caldwell as the primary complainant and Frank Miles as a secondary complainant, with Dante Cole as a witness. Cavett had S also, and this was the part that made Mara read the letter, twice contacted the Territorial Land Commissioner's office regarding the 1,875 boundary survey, and had received confirmation that the original land grant documentation for Silver Creek Ranch's eastern parcel showed no encumbrance of any kind prior to 1,880. That was the hole in Briggs's case, the one that could not be papered over or argued around. The land had been clearly titled years before the fraudulent collateral note existed, and the Territorial Land Commissioner had records going back to 1,872 that a judge would have to willfully ignore to dismiss. Nathan read the letter standing in the middle of the kitchen. He read it through twice and then put it on the table. "Started," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "There's no going back from this." "No." He sat down slowly. He rubbed his face with both hands, the first truly unguarded gesture she had seen from him. The first time he'd let himself look like what he probably was, which was a man who had been under enormous pressure for a very long time and was just now beginning to feel the full weight of it. "My father," he said. "He borrowed money he shouldn't have. He made decisions that put this place in a difficult position. That part is real, even if the rest is fraud." He looked at the letter. "I've been angry at him for 2 years for leaving me this mess." Mara waited. "And I've been angry at myself," he said, "for not seeing it sooner. For believing the numbers were just my own failure to understand." "You're not an accountant," Mara said. "Neither are you," he said. "You saw it." She was quiet for a moment. "I was looking for it," she said. "That's different. You weren't looking because you trusted the system. You trusted that a bank was a bank and a signed document meant something." She paused. "Briggs counted on that. It's not a character flaw to have trusted. What he needed." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the December wind was pushing at the kitchen walls, the kind of wind that found every gap and made the lamp flicker. Somewhere in the ranch yard, a shutter had come loose and was banging at irregular intervals, patient and irritating. "Cavett says we'll be called to Helena in the spring," Nathan said, "for the formal hearing." "I know. He says Briggs will fight this every step." "I know that too," he says. Nathan stopped. He looked at her carefully. "He says your testimony may be required about the accounting analysis, because you're the one who found and documented the discrepancies." Mara had read this part of the letter too. She had read it standing in the same kitchen, and she had put the letter down and looked out the window for a long moment before reading it again. "I know," she said. "You understand what that means," Nathan said. "Briggs's lawyers they'll question everything about me," she said. A widow with 3 children and no professional credentials who worked as a cook and somehow decided to go through her employer's financial records. She said it plainly because there was no point in dressing it up. "Yes, I know what that looks like, and..." She looked at him steadily. "And the arithmetic is still correct. I can explain how I got to every figure on those pages. I can explain what I was looking at and why it didn't match and what I did to verify it. I was careful specifically because I knew that someday someone was going to look at this work and question it, and I wanted every step to be traceable." "You thought about that from the beginning?" "I thought about it the night I found the discrepancies," she said. "Yes." Nathan was quiet. Then he said, "I should tell you something." She waited. "When Pete first brought you in," he said, "and I looked out the window and saw your children in the wagon, my first thought was that this was going to be complicated, that I was taking on more than I was looking for." He paused. "I almost told Pete to send you away." "I know," Mara said. He looked at her. "You looked like a man making a calculation," she said. "I've seen that look before. I've done the math enough times myself to recognize when someone else is doing it. I'm glad I didn't send you away," he said. It was simply said, and it was sincere, and it landed differently than it might have a few weeks ago, when she still felt the particular watchfulness of someone who didn't know yet whether the place they'd landed was safe. She thought about Thomas briefly, and about the house she'd lost, and about the look on Clara's face, the first time she'd slept somewhere that didn't feel temporary. "So am I," she said. The letter from Briggs arrived the following Tuesday. It was addressed to Nathan and written in the careful legal language of a man who had his own attorneys. Stated that in light of the complaint filed with the Territorial District Court, the acceleration clause in the ranch's loan agreements had been activated, and that full payment of all outstanding obligations, a figure listed at just over $11,000, was required within 60 days. $11,000 against a ranch that had $300 in cash. Nathan stood at the table and read it, and his face went through several things, and none of them were good. Pete read it after him and said something in a low voice that wasn't suitable for the children to hear. Danny, who had come in to return a tool, read it over Pete's shoulder and went very still. Mara took the letter, read it, and put it down. "Send it to Cavett today," she said. "He already knows about the clause," Nathan said. "It's in the complaint." "Send it anyway," she said, "with the date and the amount. Briggs putting it in writing is actually useful. It shows he's responding to the filing, which means he's taking it seriously, which means he's worried." She looked at Nathan. "Worried men make mistakes. Worried men also have 60 days to bury us," Nathan said. "They do," she said. "But so do we." She picked up the letter and set it on the sideboard, apart from everything else, where it wouldn't get mixed up with other papers. Then she went back to the stove, because there was dinner to make, and the men were going to be hungry, and the ranch was going to keep running the same way it had kept running, since October, one meal at a time, one day at a time, the understanding that the things you could control were worth controlling, even when everything else felt like it was coming apart. Frank Miles came by that afternoon, having heard through Pete that something had happened. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him and read it, and then sat back. "He's trying to scare us off," Frank said. "Yes," Mara said. "Working?" She set a cup of coffee in front of him. "Is it working for you?" Frank Miles looked at the letter for a long moment. He was a big man who had lost 80 acres of his family's land to a man who had never earned a single foot of it, and he had lived with that loss for 2 years, and you could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular weight of injustice that hasn't had anywhere to go. "No," he said, "it's not working." "Good," Mara said. "Then drink your coffee." Outside, the December wind kept coming. The loose shutter banged. One of the horses in the corral called out once, sharp and high, and then was quiet. Inside the kitchen, some things had settled that was harder and more certain than it had been that morning. Not comfort, not safety, but the particular resolve of people who have weighed what they're up against and decided to face it anyway, and who have enough company in that decision that facing it alone is no longer the shape of the thing. Mara refilled Frank's cup and her own, and they sat at the table together in the December afternoon, going through everything they knew one more time, looking for anything they'd missed. They found 2 things, and those 2 things changed everything. The 2 things Mara and Frank found that December afternoon were not dramatic on their own. That was the nature of this kind of evidence. It never arrived like a thunderclap. It arrived like water finding a crack, quiet and patient, and ultimately impossible to stop. The first was a receipt. Frank had brought a box of his own documents to the kitchen table, papers he'd been holding on to since the foreclosure. The kind of papers a man keeps because he can't bring himself to throw them away even when he believes they're useless. He hadn't looked at them carefully in over a year, but Mara had asked him to bring everything he had, and so he had, and now they were going through the box together, the way she went through everything slowly, column by column, looking for the thing that didn't match. The receipt was from Garrison Bank, dated 4 years back, and it acknowledged payment received from the Miles family account in the amount of $240 against their outstanding loan balance. Frank remembered making that payment. He'd driven into town himself, handed over the cash, watched the clerk write it down. Standard procedure. But the corresponding entry in the bank ledger copy, the one Briggs had provided to the county clerk as part of the foreclosure documentation, showed no such payment. That month appeared as a missed payment, which had triggered a penalty, which had compounded, which had eventually contributed to the justification for foreclosure. $240. Vanished from the official record. But Frank had the receipt with the bank's own stamp on it. He didn't just forge signatures, Mara said, after they'd looked at it together for a long moment. He erased payments. Frank's face had gone to a place that was beyond anger, the flat, cold look of a man who has just had his worst suspicion confirmed in writing. "I knew it didn't add up," he said, his voice very even. "I knew the number they gave me was wrong. I told the sheriff, and he said the bank's records were the official record, and my memory wasn't evidence." "Your memory isn't evidence," Mara said. "This receipt is." Turned it over in her hands. The bank stamp was clear. Clerk's initials were legible. The date matched the entry, or rather, matched the absence of the entry exactly. She set it down carefully in the center of the table. "That's the first thing," she said. The second thing came from something Frank said, almost offhandedly, while they were going through the rest of his documents, a mention of a man named Roy Decker, who had worked as a clerk at Garrison Bank for 7 years, and had left abruptly 18 months ago under circumstances that people in town had speculated about, but never confirmed. Frank had heard that Decker had tried to raise a concern about some of the bank's paperwork and had been dismissed and effectively run out of Garrison within a week. Mara stopped. "Where is he now?" she said. Frank thought about it. "I heard he went east Billings maybe, or Miles City. You don't have a more specific sense of where." "His sister married a man who runs a hardware store in Billings," Frank said. "That's all I know." It wasn't much, but a former bank clerk who had tried to raise concerns about the paperwork and been dismissed for it was potentially the most important person in this entire case, and Mara knew it immediately and completely, the way she sometimes knew things not from reasoning to a conclusion, but from the sudden clarity of a pattern becoming visible all at once. She wrote down what Frank had told her about Decker. She wrote it very carefully. The name, the approximate location, the sister, the hardware store. Then she set her pen down and looked at what she'd written. "We need to find him," she said. "He might not want to be found," Frank said. "Men who get run out of town for asking the wrong questions tend to keep their heads down afterward." "Maybe," Mara said. "But a man who tried to do the right thing and was punished for it, when someone finally comes along with the authority and the legal backing to actually use what he knows that changes the calculation." Frank looked at her. "You sound very certain about that." "I'm not certain," she said. "I'm hoping. Those are different things. But sometimes hope is the most practical tool you have." She folded the paper with Decker's information and put it in her apron pocket with everything else. That evening she told Nathan about both things. He read the receipt carefully, turned it over, held it to the lamp. She watched him understand what it meant not just for the Miles case, but for the shape of Briggs's operation more broadly. If payments had been systematically erased from the records, as well as signatures forged, then the scope of the fraud was larger and more deliberate than even the complaint currently described. "This changes what Cavett filed," Nathan said. "It expands it," Mara said, "which is better, not worse. A larger pattern is harder to dismiss as isolated error." She paused. "But we need Decker. If there was a clerk inside that bank who saw what was happening and tried to report it, his testimony would be worth more than anything we have from outside. He was there. He knows the internal procedures. He can speak to what was standard practice and what wasn't." Nathan was quiet, turning the receipt over in his hands. "Billings," he said, "possibly. Frank thinks so. That's a 4-day ride in December." "I know." He set the receipt down. "I can't leave the ranch right now. We're short-handed and the cattle need." "I'm not suggesting you go," Mara said. He looked at her. "Pete knows people in Billings," she said. "And Pete is someone a frightened man might talk to more easily than a lawyer. Lawyers make people feel like they're about to be deposed. Pete just looks like a rancher." Nathan considered this. "Pete, he's already involved. He already knows everything." She paused. "And he wants this resolved as much as anyone." Nathan thought about it for a moment longer. Then he went to find Pete. Pete's response when presented with the situation was characteristic. He asked 3 practical questions. How long would he be gone? Who would handle the fence crew in his absence? And did Nathan have enough cash to cover the trip costs? And when those questions were answered, he said he could leave Monday. He left Monday. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest of the entire affair, harder in some ways than anything that had come before, because the waiting had a quality to it that action didn't. When Mara had been working finding the discrepancies, organizing the documents, talking to Danny, sitting with Cavett, going through Frank's papers, there had been something to do with her hands and her mind, and that had kept a certain kind of fear at bay. Waiting gave it room. She cooked. She maintained the kitchen's rhythms with the same precision she always had, because the ranch still needed feeding, and because routine was the only reliable comfort she knew. She put up preserves from the last of the root cellars' stores. She organized the pantry for the deep winter ahead. She started planning what she'd need to order in January for the spring planting. But underneath all of that, she was listening. For hoofbeats that came at the wrong time. For Briggs. For anything that meant the situation was shifting before they were ready. On the 5th day of Pete's absence, one of Briggs's men came to the ranch. Not Briggs himself, one of the 2 who always flanked him. A heavy-set man with a flat face and the patient manner of someone doing a job rather than acting on any particular feeling about it. He came alone, which was different from before, and he asked to speak with Nathan. And Nathan came out to the porch and spoke with him there while Mara watched from the kitchen window. Conversation lasted about 10 minutes. When it was over, the man rode away, and Nathan came inside. He sat at the kitchen table and did not speak immediately. Mara poured coffee and sat across from him. He offered a settlement, Nathan said. Briggs is willing to forgive 70% of the claimed debt if we drop the legal complaint and agree to a deed restriction on the eastern parcel. Mara looked at him. A deed restriction, she said, limiting future development and water rights. He said it flatly, which meant he already understood what it meant. The eastern parcel's value wasn't in the grazing land alone, it was in the river access. Restricting water rights was not 70% forgiveness. It was a different kind of taking, slower and more permanent. He's scared, Mara said. He's negotiating. Men who aren't scared don't negotiate, she said. Filed that acceleration clause as a threat, and it didn't work. And now he's trying a different approach, which means Cavit's filing has him worried, and he's trying to find a way to cut his losses before it goes further. Nathan was quiet. She looked at him carefully. Are you considering it? He didn't answer right away. She let the silence sit. No, he said finally. But I want to be honest, there's a part of me that would like this to be over. That looks at 70% forgiveness and thinks about how much simpler things would be. He looked at the table. That's the part of me I don't trust right now. That's a reasonable part of you to have, Mara said. This has been a long fight and it isn't over. But if we settle, Frank Miles gets nothing. The other families on my list get nothing. Roy Decker, wherever he is, went through what he went through for nothing. And Briggs keeps the bank and keeps doing what he's been doing to the next family that comes along. She said it without heat, just laying it out. You have to decide what you're fighting for. If you're fighting for Silver Creek, a settlement might be defensible. If you're fighting for something larger than Silver Creek, she paused, then you already know the answer. Nathan looked at her for a long time. Tell me something, he said. When you were going through those ledgers the first time, when you found the discrepancies, were you frightened? Thought about it honestly. Yes, of Briggs, of being wrong, she said. I was more afraid of having made a mistake and pulling everyone into a fight based on my arithmetic error than I was of Briggs himself. She paused. I'm still a little afraid of that, even now. But you kept going. I checked the arithmetic again, she said, and then again. And when I was as sure as I could make myself, I showed it to you. That's all you can do with fear. Make sure you've done the work, and then keep going anyway. Nathan nodded slowly. He picked up the coffee cup. Put it down again. I'll write to Cavett, he said. Tell him there was a settlement offer, and we declined. Do that today, Mara said, before the next visit. Pete came back on a Thursday, 12 days after he'd left, arriving in the late afternoon with his horse tired and his coat stiff with cold, and an expression on his face that Mara read before he'd said a single word. He'd found Decker. Roy Decker was living in Billings in a rented room above his brother-in-law's hardware store, doing bookkeeping work for 3 small businesses in the area. He was 41 years old and had not, in 18 months, spoken to anyone about what he'd seen at Garrison Bank, because he had a family to consider, and because the man who had dismissed him had also ensured, through quiet networks, that no bank in a 3-county radius would hire him. He had listened to Pete for 2 hours, and then he had said yes. He would give a statement. He would travel to Helena for the hearing. He had, as it turned out, kept something, not the documents themselves, which he'd had no access to after his dismissal, but his own private notes, kept in a small notebook that had been in his coat pocket when he was escorted from the building. Notes about specific transactions that hadn't sat right with him. Dates, amounts, reference numbers. The kind of detailed internal records that only someone who had worked inside that institution would have known to write down. Pete put the notebook on the kitchen table. It was small, maybe 50 pages, half of them filled. The handwriting was neat and precise and professional. Mara opened it and looked at the first entry. She had to read it twice to fully understand what she was seeing. Then she looked up at Pete. This goes back 6 years, she said. 7, Pete said. That first entry is from 77. She looked back at the notebook. Roy Decker had been watching this for 7 years. 7 years of noticing things that were wrong and writing them down in his own private record. Not because he'd been planning to use them, but because he was a man who believed in accurate records and couldn't stop himself from keeping them. He's willing to testify, Pete said again. He wants to. He's been carrying this for a year and a half, and Pete paused, choosing his words carefully. He said he didn't come forward before because he didn't think anyone would believe him over Briggs. But a legal case already filed with multiple complainants, with a territorial court already involved, that's different. Nathan was looking at the notebook over Mara's shoulder. We need to get this to Cavett immediately, Nathan said. I know, Mara said. She was already calculating the mail rider, the timing, what Cavett would need to amend the filing. Pete, how soon can Decker travel to Helena if needed? He said 2 weeks' notice is enough. All right. She closed the notebook carefully. This changes the hearing. This isn't just about Silver Creek and Frank Miles anymore. This is 7 years of internal evidence from inside the bank itself. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the burlap over the garden window that Mara kept meaning to replace with proper glass and hadn't gotten to yet. Briggs is going to know, Pete said. When Decker surfaces as a witness, Briggs will know. Yes, Mara said. He will. That's when it gets dangerous, Pete said. Not as a warning so much as a statement of fact. Pete operated in facts. It's already dangerous, Mara said. It became dangerous when we filed. All that changing is now is that Briggs's options are narrowing, and men whose options are narrowing make different choices than men who feel comfortable. She paused. We need to make sure all the documents are secure. Everything copied, everything in multiple locations, nothing that can be lost without a backup existing somewhere Briggs can't reach. She looked at Danny, who had come in from outside midway through Pete's return and had been listening from near the stove. Your notarized statement, you still have your copy? In my bedroll, Danny said. Keep it there, she said. Not in the bunkhouse storage. On your person or in your bedroll? He nodded. She looked at Nathan. The original ledgers need to go somewhere off the ranch. Somewhere Briggs wouldn't think to look. Nathan thought for a moment. Grace Elliott, he said. Mara nodded. That was right. Grace Elliott, 12 miles east, who had notarized Danny's statement without blinking, and who had the self-possessed quality of a woman who had been dealing with difficult circumstances her entire life and wasn't about to be rattled now. Take them tomorrow, Nathan said. 2 things happened in January that moved the case from preparation to confrontation. The first was that Cavett wrote to say the hearing date had been set for the 2nd week of March in Helena. The territorial district court judge assigned to the case was a man named Harlan Voss, who Cavett described in careful, lawyerly language as known for his rigorous standards of evidence, which, he noted, worked in their favor given the quality of the documentation they had assembled. The second thing was that Walter Briggs came to Silver Creek Ranch, not on a Monday, not with his 2 hired men, but alone and unannounced on a Friday afternoon in January, and he did not ask to see Nathan. He asked to see Mara. She heard this from Danny, who came to the kitchen with a look on his face she didn't like. She wiped her hands on her apron and went out to the porch. Briggs was standing in the yard. He had ridden alone, which she had noted when she heard the single horse, and he stood now with his hat in his hands, a calculated posture. She understood immediately, the deliberate visual language of a man presenting himself as non-threatening. She stood on the porch and looked at him, and did not come down the steps. Mrs. Whitlock, he said. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. I was hoping we might have a conversation. All right, she said. She didn't move from the porch. He looked at her for a moment, clearly having expected her to come down, to meet him at his level, to extend the social courtesies that would have put them on more equal footing. She didn't. She stayed on the step, which put her slightly above him, and she waited. I'm going to be direct with you, he said. Please, she said. You're a smart woman, he said. Smarter than most people have given you credit for, clearly. Smart enough to have found things in those ledgers that I'll confess I underestimated the likelihood of anyone finding. He paused, as if this admission cost him something, though she suspected it cost him nothing. Smart enough to have organized something that has caused me considerable inconvenience. She said nothing. I also understand you're a woman in a difficult position, he said. A widow, 3 children, no property of your own. You found a situation here that offers you stability, and I respect that. Stability is worth protecting. She heard what was underneath this. She had heard this kind of thing before, not from men like Briggs, but from the same basic architecture of it, the implicit threat wrapped in apparent sympathy, the suggestion that what she had could be taken away. What is it you'd like, Mr. Briggs? She said. Something shifted in his face, the pleasantness getting a fraction thinner. I'd like to resolve this situation without it going any further. Complaint that's been filed is based on a misreading of complex financial records by someone who, however capable, is not a professional in this field. If it goes to hearing, it will be examined by people who understand these things thoroughly, and I'm confident the result will be unfavorable to you, Mara said. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. You're here because you're confident it will be unfavorable to you. You sent a settlement offer 3 weeks ago, and it was declined. And now you're here speaking to me because you've decided I might be a weaker point than Nathan. She paused. I'm not. Briggs looked at her. The pleasant expression had not disappeared entirely, but it had reorganized into something more honest, which was also more cold. "You're making an enemy of a man who has significant resources and a long memory," he said. "I want you to understand that clearly before this goes to Helena." "I understand it clearly," she said. "And you're not concerned." "I didn't say that," she said. "I said I understand it. Those aren't the same thing." He put his hat back on his head. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than comfortable, the kind of look designed to make its object feel the weight of what they were choosing. She held it without blinking. "You should think very carefully," he said. "I have been thinking very carefully," she said, "since October. That's rather the problem for you, I think." He turned and went back to his horse. She stayed on the porch and watched him ride out of the yard and down the road until he was past the gate and out of sight. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly. She had not let them shake while he was there, but now they shook, and she let them. Nathan came in 10 minutes later, having seen Briggs arrive and having stayed away because she'd signaled him to with a look. When she'd come out, she'd needed to handle this without Nathan's presence altering the dynamic. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. He said, "Yes," she said. Her hands had stopped shaking. "What did he want?" "To see if I could be persuaded to step back," she said. "Or frightened. Either would have worked for him." And neither worked. She looked up at Nathan. "He's worried about the hearing. He's trying everything he has left that doesn't involve direct action, because he knows that direct action at this point, with a case already before the court, would be its own form of evidence against him." Nathan came in and sat across from her. He looked at her face. "Mara," she looked at him. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. "When this is over, however it ends, I want you to know that what you've done here is not something I'm going to forget. Not the cooking, not the ledgers, not any of it." He said it carefully, the way he said most important things without embellishment, looking at the table more than at her. "You didn't have to do any of this. You came here for a job, and you ended up fighting a land fraud case in the Montana Territory," she said. "Yes." Something almost like a real smile that. She looked at him for a moment, the tired, genuine, complicated face of a man who was learning to carry things with other people rather than alone, which was harder than it sounded for someone who had been alone in it for a long time. "The ranch needed it," she said simply, "and so did you." He nodded, not dismissing it, not elaborating on it, just receiving it. The weeks between January and March moved both too fast and too slowly. Cavett filed the amended complaint in February, incorporating Roy Decker's testimony and the Miles family receipt. The amended filing was substantially larger than the original. It now named 11 families, in addition to Nathan and Frank Miles, all identified from Mara's original list, all sharing the same pattern of erased payments and forged documents. Decker's notebook provided the internal mechanism, the how of it, the procedural steps Briggs had used inside the bank to make falsified records appear legitimate. Briggs's lawyers responded immediately, filing motions to dismiss on grounds of insufficient evidence and improper standing. Judge Voss denied both motions in the same week, which Cavett said was significant. A judge who wanted to find a way to dismiss this case had been given 2 clear opportunities and had not taken them. The ranch functioned. The cattle were fed and the fences held, and the men did their work. And every evening they came into a kitchen that smelled like something worth coming in for, and every evening the table was loud with conversation in the way it had gotten loud over the winter, gradually, and without anyone deciding it would. Clara had started helping Mara more substantively, not just washing dishes, but actually cooking, learning the timing and the proportions and the particular logic of feeding many people from limited supplies. She was quick, the way Mara had been quick at that age, with the same quality of attention that didn't need to be told things twice. Danny had taken to teaching Owen basic fence repair on afternoons when the work allowed, which Owen had initially complained about and then quietly become invested in. Bessa had claimed the barn cat entirely and named him Corporal, for reasons she declined to explain. In the middle of February, 3 of the ranch hands came to Mara separately, and within the same week, each one asking a version of the same question, whether there was anything they could do, whether their names on a statement of some kind would be useful, whether they were going to Helena with the rest of them. Told them they were going. Not as witnesses, but as the people who had kept a ranch running while the people who owned it were fighting for its survival, and whose presence would matter in ways that didn't require legal testimony. She saw something happen in their faces when she said that. The particular thing that happens when a person who has felt peripheral discovers they are not. The night before they left for Helena, Mara sat in the kitchen alone after everyone else had gone to bed. She had the original 2 pages of notes in front of her, the ones she'd made the first night she'd found the discrepancies, the ones she'd been carrying in the flour canister copy, and the root cellar copy, and the Bible copy ever since. She looked at them. Her own handwriting, made at a kitchen table at midnight by the light of a single lamp, uncertain but meticulous, every figure double-checked, every discrepancy documented. She thought about the night she'd made these, the sleeplessness of it, the fear underneath the calculation, the understanding that she had found something that was going to make her life considerably more complicated, and that she could still, at that point, have put it back and said nothing. She had not put it back. She folded the papers and put them in her coat pocket. She would take them to Helena. She would sit in a territorial courtroom and explain, to a judge and to lawyers, and to whatever Briggs's attorneys threw at her, exactly how she had found these numbers, and what they meant and why they were correct. She would answer every question put to her clearly and without flinching. She was not a lawyer. She was not a banker. She was a widow with 3 children and an $11 starting point and a particular stubbornness about things that were wrong that she had never quite been able to switch off, even when it would have been easier. Bank the stove for the night. She checked the kitchen one more time habit, the last round check before bed, making sure everything was in its place. It was. She put on her coat and went out to the smokehouse to sleep. Tomorrow, Helena. The hearing lasted 3 days. Mara had expected the courtroom to feel large and intimidating, and it did, but not in the way she'd expected. It wasn't the physical space, it was a specific quality of attention in it, the way every person in the room was watching something and calculating something, and the awareness that what happened here would outlast the room itself. Cavett was the architect and the general. He moved through the courtroom with the practiced unhurriedness of a man who had done this specific thing many times, and who understood that calm was its own kind of argument. He presented the forged signatures first, because they were the foundation, and he presented them with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that a judge's confidence was built through consistent, careful accumulation of detail. Briggs's lawyers were expensive and thorough. They challenged everything they could challenge. They questioned Mara's qualifications, as she had known they would, and she answered every question put to her about her methodology directly and without defensiveness, because defensiveness was what they were trying to produce. She explained how she had found the discrepancies. She explained how she had verified her arithmetic. She explained what she had seen in the signature comparison and how she had documented it before showing it to anyone else. She spoke for nearly 2 hours across 2 separate sessions on the witness stand, and she was not perfect. She misquoted one figure by $3 and had to correct herself, and there was a moment when one of Briggs's lawyers asked her a question she didn't fully understand, and she said so rather than guessing, but she was accurate, and she was unshakable, and when Cavett's redirect was finished, the judge looked at her over his spectacles for a moment in a way she couldn't entirely read. Roy Decker testified on the second day. He was a small, quiet man who had clearly spent 18 months being nervous about this moment, and the nervousness showed, but so did the 7 years of careful record-keeping in a small notebook that he'd carried in his coat pocket since the day he'd walked out of Garrison Bank. He read entries aloud in a voice that grew steadier as the morning went on, and Briggs's lawyers challenged his credibility, and he responded to every challenge with the specific, unadorned clarity of a man who had written things down because he believed in writing things down and had no other motivation that anyone could convincingly demonstrate. Frank Miles testified about the receipt. Danny Cole testified about the signatures in the barn and the men who had broken his ribs, and when he described that the details of it, the specific words they'd used the courtroom was quieter than it had been at any other moment in 3 days. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Judge Harlan Voss took a 2-hour recess. They waited in a room down the hall. Nathan, Pete, Mara, Frank Miles, Danny, Cavett, and the other 3 complainant families who had traveled to Helena. Nobody said much. Nathan sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped. Pete stood near the window and looked at the street. Frank Miles ate the entire contents of a paper bag of biscuits that Mara had made the morning they left and had been carrying in her bag without mentioning it, and then looked slightly embarrassed. Danny sat in the corner with his arms crossed, not nervous exactly, but as if he had gone somewhere inside himself that was quiet. Mara sat and waited, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the only way she knew how to wait. When they went back into the courtroom, Judge Voss looked at the parties on both sides for a moment before he spoke. What he said took approximately 12 minutes and used the careful, constructed language of legal findings. Mara followed as much of it as she could and let the parts she couldn't follow wash past her, listening for the architecture of it, the shape of the conclusion. The shape became clear. The forged signatures were found to be sufficient grounds for invalidating the 4 promissory notes in question. The erased payment from the Miles account, in conjunction with Decker's internal records, established a pattern of systematic fraud. The collateral claim on Silver Creek's eastern parcel was found to be without legal basis, given the prior established title. The acceleration clause, having been applied to debts that the court found fraudulent, was itself unenforceable. Briggs's empire of paper was coming apart in a territorial courtroom in Helena on a March afternoon, while the man himself sat at his lawyer's table and showed almost nothing on his face, which was the thing Mara would remember most about him. When she looked back on this, not the moment of defeat, but the controlled flatness of it, the face of a man who had been preparing for this contingency while simultaneously hoping it wouldn't arrive. The court ordered a full audit of Garrison Bank's records to be conducted by a court-appointed examiner. All foreclosures undertaken using the same documentation patterns identified in the complaint were subject to review. Restitution proceedings for affected families were to begin within 60 days. Mara sat in the courtroom and heard all of this and felt something that was not triumph and was not relief, but was somewhere between them, a kind of quiet, tired resolution, the feeling of a very long weight being set down. She looked at Nathan. He was looking at the judge, and then he closed his eyes for a moment, briefly, and then he opened them again. Pete was nodding slowly at nothing in particular. Danny had both hands over his face. Frank Miles was sitting with his hands on his knees and his jaw working, and his eyes very bright, and he was looking at the middle distance, and Mara could see clearly that he was thinking about 80 acres along a river that had belonged to his family for 20 years. Proceedings continued for a while, longer formalities, scheduling, Cavett speaking briefly with the court, and then they were in the hallway. And then they were outside in the cold March air with the mountains gray and enormous around Helena and the sky that particular blue it got at altitude. And nobody said anything for a moment. Then Frank Miles laughed. It was a short, unexpected sound, more disbelief than humor, and it broke the silence. And Pete said something dry under his breath that made Nathan shake his head. And Danny took a long, slow breath and let it out. Mara stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the mountains. The audit would take months. The restitution proceedings would take longer. Briggs would face separate criminal proceedings, which Cavett had already indicated were likely given the scope of what the audit would expose. None of this was finished. The paperwork of justice was as slow and painstaking as the paperwork of fraud. The ground had shifted, irreversibly, documentably, legally shifted. She thought about the night she had sat in a stranger's kitchen with a lamp and 2 pages of arithmetic and decided that not checking was no longer an option she was willing to take. Thought about the fear underneath that decision and the stubbornness underneath the fear. Nathan came to stand beside her on the steps. "We should start back tomorrow," he said. "The ranch has been short-handed." "Yes," she said. "Cavett said the audit will begin within the month. They'll want you available if they have additional questions." "I'll be available," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains too, or at the street she wasn't entirely sure. "You know," he said, "when I gave you those ledgers back in October, I told myself it was because you'd asked and you had a right to look, and it would get you to stop being quietly persistent about it." He paused, but that wasn't actually why. She looked at him. "I gave them to you," he said, "because I've been trying to read them alone for 2 years and getting nowhere. And for the first time since my father died, I was standing in a room with someone who seemed like they might actually be able to see what I couldn't." He said it simply, without making it larger than it was. "So, that's all." Mara looked at him for a moment. "That's enough," she said. They went back to the others. They started making arrangements for the morning. Around them, the city of Helena continued its afternoon business, and the mountains held their positions against the sky. And somewhere in a courtroom behind them, Clerk was writing down what had just been decided in language that would outlast all of them. It was enough. They rode back to Silver Creek over 4 days, and the weather held for 3 of them. The 4th day brought snow, not a punishing storm, just the steady, indifferent snowfall that Montana produced in March as a matter of routine, as if the territory wanted to remind everyone that a courthouse ruling in Helena meant nothing to the mountains. They rode through it with their collars up, and their horses patient. And nobody complained, because complaining about Montana weather was the kind of thing you did in the first year and stopped doing after that. Mara rode beside Nathan most of the way. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying, yet the talking would come later. The kind that required a table and coffee, and the particular quiet of a place you'd return to, rather than a road you were still on. For now it was enough to be moving in the same direction, with the same destination, and to know what was waiting there. Pete rode ahead most of the time, which was his way. Danny rode with Frank Miles for the first 2 days, the two of them talking in the low, comfortable register of men who had been through something together and were figuring out what kind of people they were to each other on the other side of it. Frank turned off at his own property on the afternoon of the third day, and he shook Nathan's hand and then, unexpectedly, turned to Mara and said simply, "Thank you." Not elaborating on it, not making a speech. Just those 2 words, said straight, and she understood that he meant them in a way that went further back than the hearing and further forward than the restitution proceedings. All the way to a December afternoon at a kitchen table when she had looked at a receipt with a bank stamp on it and understood what it meant. She nodded. He rode toward his property, and she watched him go, and thought about the 80 acres he was going to get back. Silver Creek looked the same when they rode in through the gate. It always looked the same, and she had learned by now that this was not a failure of the place, but a quality of it, the particular constancy of somewhere, that had been standing through seasons for long enough that no single event could rearrange its appearance overnight. The barn was still leaning slightly in the same direction. The fence line still needed that one section between the north posts replaced. The kitchen window still had burlap over it where the glass had never been replaced. The men who had stayed behind came out to meet them in the yard. There were 9 of them, the ones who had kept the cattle fed and the fences checked and the daily work of the ranch moving, while everyone else was in Helena, and they stood in the cold with their breath making small clouds and waited. Nathan looked at them from his horse. "It went well," he said. That was all he said, but the way he said it, the particular release of tension in it, the plain statement carrying the weight of everything underneath, was enough. One of the older hands, a man named Cass, who had been at Silver Creek for 8 years, and said less than almost anyone, nodded once, and went back to the barn. The others dispersed in 1s and 2s, back to whatever they'd been doing. That was all, no ceremony, no celebration out in the cold. That would come later, inside, around the table, in the way that real things were absorbed gradually, over food and warmth, in the company of people you'd learned to trust. Mara got off her horse and went to the kitchen. She built up the fire. She looked in the pantry and assessed what was there less than she'd have liked. The winter stores running low, in the way they always did by March, but workable. She found salt pork and dried beans, and the last of the cornmeal, and some potatoes that had been in the roots since November, and were still mostly good. She started a pot. Clara appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, having ridden in the wagon with Owen and Bess, and she stood looking at her mother at the stove for a moment. "I'll help," she said. "Get the cornmeal," Mara said. They worked side by side in the kitchen the way they had been working together since October, in the easy, practiced rhythm of people who have cooked together long enough to move around each other without narrating it. Owen came in and put wood near the stove without being asked. Bess appeared with the barn cat, who she deposited near the warmth of the stove, with the authority of a child who considers these decisions made. Mara watched her children settle back into this kitchen the way water settles back into a shape it knows, and she felt something that she didn't try to name right away. Just let it sit in her chest and do what it was going to do. Formal proceedings took the rest of that year. Court-appointed examiner arrived at Garrison Bank in April and spent 6 weeks working through the records, and what he found there was larger than even Decker's notebook had suggested. Briggs had been running the same scheme in variations for nearly a decade, erased payments, forged instruments, manipulated interest calculations, fraudulent collateral claims on land that had been titled clear for generations. 14 families in total had been affected. The combined fraudulent debt amounted to something over $60,000. Walter Briggs was formally charged in May. His lawyers fought the criminal proceedings the way his lawyers had fought everything with money and delay, and the particular exhausting persistence of people being paid to persist. But the examiner's report was thorough. Decker's testimony was specific, and the document record was what it was. The fraud had been built on paper, and paper, it turned out, was not as forgiving as Briggs had counted on. He was convicted in October on 12 counts, sentenced in November, and was out of Garrison Bank before the first snow of winter. Mara read the news of the conviction in a letter from Cavett, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. She read it through once, put it down, picked up her coffee, and sat with it for a while. She wasn't satisfied in the way she'd thought she might be. She had expected something cleaner, some sense of completion that arrived fully formed. What she felt instead was more complicated, a kind of tired acknowledgement, the feeling of a long project being finished, and the strange flatness that sometimes followed. The 14 families would get their restitution money over the next 2 years, in amounts that wouldn't restore exactly what they'd lost, but would come close enough to matter. Frank Miles had already gotten confirmation that the 80 acres would be returned to his family. 3 of the other foreclosures were being reversed entirely. These were real things. These were the things that had been fought for. But a conviction didn't restore the years. It didn't give back the time families had spent in fear and uncertainty. Didn't undo the broken ribs Danny had carried for 8 weeks without telling anyone why. That was the thing nobody talked about in the aftermath of justice, that justice was a settling of accounts, not a reversal of damage. It mattered enormously, and it couldn't fix everything. And living with both of those facts at the same time was its own kind of work. She put the letter away and went back to making breakfast. In December a year, nearly to the day, after Mara had first lit a fire in Silver Creek's ruined kitchen, Nathan came to find her in the garden. She was putting the beds to rest for winter, turning the soil in the way you did at the end of the season to prepare it for spring, which was cold and unglamorous work that she had nonetheless come to find steadying. There was something honest about gardening that she appreciated. It didn't pretend. You put the work in and you waited, and either the thing grew or it didn't, and either way you came back next spring and tried again. Nathan stood at the edge of the garden and watched her for a moment. "Cold day for that," he said. "It needs doing," she said without looking up. He came and crouched at the garden's edge, which was not something he usually did, and she paused and looked at him. His face was doing the controlled thing, which by now she could read as easily as any other expression it meant. He had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say, and was trying to find the plainest way to it. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "You've been here a year," he said, "and I've watched you." He paused. "I've watched you take a place that was falling apart and make it into something that actually works. Not just the kitchen, the people in it, the way things run." He looked at the turned soil for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this properly, and I've come to the conclusion that there's no proper way, so I'm just going to say it plainly." She rested the back of the spade on the ground and waited. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because the ranch needs a cook. Because this place is different with you in it, and I am different with you in it, and I would like you to stay. Permanently. In whatever way you're willing to stay." It was not elegant. He knew it wasn't elegant. She could see that he knew it from the slight tension around his jaw, the way he'd said plainly before saying it and then hadn't quite achieved plainly anyway. She looked at him, the tired, real, complicated face of a man who had spent a year learning to let someone else carry some of the weight, and who was now asking, in the only way he knew how, whether that might continue. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the house she'd lost and the road after it, the $11.40 and the wagon and the hunger on her children's faces. She thought about the night she'd arrived at this gate and the kitchen she'd walked into and the 2 pages of arithmetic that had started everything. She thought about Clara, who was learning to cook and learning to read ranch accounts both, who had a sharpness in her that needed room. About Owen, who had quietly become the person on the ranch that the horses trusted most, which was not nothing. About Bess, who had named a barn cat corporal and considered Silver Creek Ranch her home with the absolute conviction of a 6-year-old who has decided a thing. She thought about herself. What she wanted, which was a question she had not asked in a long time, because wanting things had felt like a luxury she hadn't been able to afford. "All right," she said. Nathan looked at her. "All right. You'll stay?" "All right, I'll stay," she said. "Permanently. In whatever way makes sense." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's good," in the same tone he used when something practical had been resolved, and she almost laughed. "Yes," she said, "it is." What Mara understood by the end of that year was something she hadn't had language for when she'd arrived. She had come to Silver Creek Ranch with nothing that part of the story was true. $11, worn clothes, 3 children, the accumulated weight of a life that had gone wrong in ways that weren't entirely anyone's fault. She had expected to survive. She had expected to work hard enough that no one could justify sending her away, and to keep her children fed, and to find some small daily ground to stand on. She had not expected the kitchen to become the center of something. She had not expected that feeding people consistently and well would turn out to be not just sustenance, but a kind of argument, an ongoing, daily argument that people were worth caring for, that a place could be worth maintaining, that broken things had not necessarily lost their value. She had not expected to find, buried in ledgers that weren't hers, a wrong that someone needed to see. She had not expected to be the person who saw it. People talk about bravery as if it arrives fully formed, as if there is a moment when a person makes a grand choice to become courageous. That had not been her experience. What she had experienced was a series of small decisions, each one only slightly larger than the one before, to look at the ledgers, to check the arithmetic again, to tell Nathan, to find Danny, to write to Cavett, to sit on a courthouse porch, and not come down the steps when Walter Briggs wanted her to. None of those had felt like bravery from the inside. From the inside, they had felt like the only available option for someone who had decided that not looking was no longer something she was willing to do. That was the thing nobody told you about resilience. It wasn't a quality you either had or didn't have. It was a practice. Like cooking, you did it badly at first, and then less badly, and some days everything you made was wrong, and you made it anyway. And over time you got to the point where the doing of it became simply who you were. Danny Cole got a letter in the spring from a territorial investigator, thanking him for his testimony and confirming that his name had been formally noted in the court record as a material witness whose account had been essential to the outcome. He read the letter at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He didn't say much about it, but Mara noticed, in the weeks after that he carried himself slightly differently, not bigger, not louder, just more settled, as if something that had been leaning in him had found its footing. Roy Decker received a letter of a different kind from a bank in Billings, offering him a position as a senior clerk. The letter referenced his experience and his reputation for accuracy. Cavett had made a point of mentioning Decker's record-keeping in his summary to the court, and that mention had traveled through the particular networks that financial institutions use to find reliable people. Decker sent a note to Mara to tell her, brief and slightly formal, the way he wrote everything. She read it twice and was glad. Frank Miles's 80 acres were returned in June. He sent a letter with it, just a sentence really. He said the grass was already coming up on the riverbank. Kitchen window got its glass in April. It was not a dramatic thing. Nathan found a piece of the right size at the hardware store in Garrison, which felt different now, smaller and less menacing. Town in the process of recalibrating itself, now that the bank that had organized a decade of its financial life was under new management and court supervision. He brought the glass home in the wagon, wrapped in cloth, and installed it on a Saturday morning while Mara was making bread. She watched him work from across the kitchen. He was not particularly skilled at glazing windows. He said as much twice, and once asked Pete for advice. Pete didn't have, and the result, when he was finished, was slightly uneven at one corner. Not enough to matter, just enough to be real. She looked through it at the garden, through actual glass, for the first time since October. Crooked, she said, I know, Nathan said, climbing down from the stool. It'll do, she said. He looked at her. It'll do, she said again, and went back to the bread. That was Silver Creek Ranch by the second spring. Not fixed, not perfected, not the transformed and gleaming thing that the stories about places like this tended to promise. The barn door still hung at a slight angle. There were sections of fence that needed replacing. The ranch ran on thin margins and hard work, and the accumulated stubbornness of people who had decided it was worth maintaining. Kitchen window had glass in it. The table was full at every meal. The garden was planted. Danny was still there, and Cass, and the others who had stayed through the hardest winter, and 3 new hands who had come on in the spring and were learning the particular rhythms of this place, which had rhythms worth learning. Clara was 14 now, and she had started keeping her own household accounts. A small notebook in her careful handwriting, every expenditure noted against every dollar available. Mara had not suggested this. Clara had decided it herself, which was the kind of thing that told you something about a person. Owen had gotten tall in the way. Boys got tall between 12 and 13 suddenly, inconveniently, as if his body had made a decision without consulting anyone. He could fix a fence section now without being shown, and he had a particular way with the horses that the other hands had noticed and begun to quietly rely on. Bess was 7 and had opinions about everything, and communicated most of them to Corporal the barn cat, who endured this with considerable patience. On an evening in late May, after the dinner dishes were done and the children were settled, and the last light was sitting long and flat across the pasture, Mara stood at the kitchen window and looked out. The mountains were doing what they always did at this hour, holding the light differently from the land, going their own particular purple-gray against a sky that still had color in it. The grass in the lower pasture was the specific green of a Montana May, which was a more intense and improbable green than any other month because the winter had been so complete. The horses were moving slowly at the far end of the corral. She thought about the woman who had stood at the gate 11 months ago with $11 and 3 children and a willingness to start. She had not known, standing at that gate, that she was about to find something in a ledger book that would consume most of a year and take her to a territorial courthouse and make her an enemy of a powerful man, and on the other side of all of that land her here, at this window, in this kitchen, looking at this pasture in this light. She had not known any of that. She had known only that she needed work, and her children needed shelter, and the stove was that way. That was the thing about beginning. You didn't know what you were beginning. You knew only that staying where you were was no longer possible, and so you moved, and the moving itself was the act of faith. If faith was the right word for it, and maybe it was, the secular kind, the kind that didn't require anything overhead, just the willingness to put your foot forward when you couldn't see the ground. She had put her foot forward, and the ground had been there. Nathan came in from outside, bringing the cold air with him the way he always did, shrugging out of his coat. He looked at her at the window. "Something out there," he said. "Just looking," she said. He came and stood beside her, looking out at the pasture in the last of the light, close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off his coat. "Good day," said. It was a plain statement, the kind he made not a question, not an elaboration. Just an observation that the day had been a good one, and that he was noting it. "Yes," she said. Outside the last light went off the mountains, and the pasture went blue, and the first stars started in the east over the far ridge, faint and patient, the way they always started, like things that had been there all along, waiting for it to be dark enough to be seen. Inside the kitchen, the stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted. The window was straight enough. Mara stayed where she was. She was home.